All right, all right. Man, I wish I was as good as that intro sounded. Oh, man. Man, thank you all for your support. Thank you to the previous speakers. I've got a lot of ground to cover and not enough time to do it. I'm talking today about Frederick Douglass. He's one of the more popular figures in African American church history, but if you haven't had time to read his original works, to learn of his life, you may miss some really meaningful things that speak directly to what we're trying to accomplish in this conference today. So before I get into talking about the life and faith of Frederick Douglass, I kind of want to set the tone just a little bit in that as a lover and studier of history, I have to acknowledge, and I think we should all do a better job of acknowledging, that history is messy. History is violent. The stories are unseemly. And one of the disservices that we've done, and one of the reasons why I believe we're so susceptible to repeat history that is detrimental to us, is because our eyes have become too accustomed to sanitization. We don't want to acknowledge and call things for what they are. And so in every aspect of our lives, we sanitize reality. When our loved ones die, we'll do everything we can to not say they're dead. We'll say they've gone home, or they've passed on, or we're not going to a funeral, we're going to a memorial. It's very rare now to go to a funeral and see an actual dead body that you can touch, because death is so hard to look at that we sanitize it and prefer to cremate our loved ones and to put their ashes in this beautiful urn. But what we're looking at is death, and we sanitize it. And I say this to say that I want to do my best to talk to you about the life and faith of Frederick Douglass. But what's meaningful about his life and faith, it gains meaning when we are honest about the conditions in which he lived and had to process his faith. I feel like I would do him and you a disservice if I completely sanitized the retelling of his life and his faith. And so I'm going to, not unnecessarily, and there may be one or two times where I use words that you're not accustomed to hearing anymore, especially maybe in a church. But I think we need to really look at history so we can learn from it and not repeat it. If I say something that gives you a guttural response, like I really didn't want to hear that, and people shouldn't say that, and people shouldn't have to hear that, good. That should be the response to hearing vile things. But if we sanitize everything, then we forget how vile these things really are. And so I want to be faithful, I want to be tasteful, but I can't make a promise that I'm going to completely spare you and present this sanitized version of American chattel slavery. If we're going to be honest, part of that is making I don't know if you call it a resurgence, but there's a growing movement today to retell, to sanitize the history of slavery in America, to present it and reinterpret what happened during a vile time in our history, and almost to retell these stories and say, hey, you know what, slavery, really wasn't that bad. Slavery was, it was common everywhere. It's really not that special. To say things like, ultimately, it was for the overall good that black people, even though slavery, well, they'll say it's bad, but there was a lot of good that came from it. Raise your hand if you've heard, read, these attempts to sanitize things that cannot be sanitized. And so, I'm going to push back against that intentionally today by reflecting and sharing the stories of the life of Frederick Douglass. And one of the big questions, I forgot that I'm working the clicker, all right. One of the big questions that I want to look at, and as I process this, was what role did his Christian faith, what role did the Christian faith of Frederick Douglass play in his life, how he processed slavery, how he pursued freedom, how he fought for justice after he attained it. What did his faith, how does his faith inform that? And so before we get all the way there, I'm going to start by sharing what I think, after spending countless hours and reading countless pages of his original writings and works, what I think is the single most impactful moment of his entire life. I think everything in his life leading up to this moment, I think nothing made sense to him leading up to this moment, and everything made sense to him after this moment. And I think it all comes down to this one moment, in this one sentence that was uttered to him at the age of about 9 years old. He was in the presence of his master, and I'm going to come back to this later in further detail, but someone unknowingly was teaching him the alphabet, teaching him how to read. And the master of the house stepped in and shut it down. And Frederick, young Freddie they called him, overheard the master utter this. He said, "If you give an inch, he will take an L." What does that mean? If an L, so we have a familiar saying that maybe you've heard. If you give someone an inch, they'll take what? A mile. Well, he overheard the master reprimanding his teacher. He said, if you give an inch, he will take an L. An L is a dead form of measurement that went from the elbow to the wrist. If that sounds familiar, this is the English equivalent of the biblical cubit. So when they were measuring in the Old Testament, and they were making the sanctuary and all that stuff, and they had cubits, the L would have been the English equivalent of that. He'll take an L. And Frederick, after hearing that and overhearing that, and they underestimated, at the young age of 8 or 9 years old, they underestimated his level of comprehension and critical thinking, and he realized that there's something to this knowledge thing here that I can't let go. And he says, they've already given me the inch, and I've resolved to take the L. And so I've titled my speech for today, Resolved to Take the L. But what is it? What was the L that he took? What was the nugget of knowledge that he received, that he hung on to? What was the thread that he kept pulling on over and over and over again? And as he grew in this specific type of knowledge, caused him to fight for his freedom at any cost. Let's work our way there. First, his early life. Frederick Douglass was born on a Maryland slave plantation in 1817, maybe. The record keeping for slaves, it wasn't a hugely important thing, so many slaves didn't know their exact age. Even he, late in life, he estimates that he might be off by a year or two. So 1817 on a Maryland plantation, roughly, is when he was born. He was born, his full name was Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. And now, Bailey, if you notice, like, where'd that last name come from? So his situation growing up was that he actually knew who his grandmother was. And his grandmother was, her maiden name, or her surname, if you will, was Bailey, Betsy Bailey. And so his name that he was born with was actually Bailey. Frederick was separated from his mother pretty much instantly at birth. This was common in the culture of their plantation. What happened was, well, let me get to that. He was separated from his mother, and he only remembers her face maybe a handful of times of seeing his mother, and always at nighttime. He talks about seeing his mother's face and remembering his mother's face with candlelight, because he only ever saw her during the dark. Part of this was because they were separated. The mothers would give birth. The babies are now instantly the possession of the slave owner. And then the mother would be sent off to go back to work wherever she had to go to work from. And so this particular slave owner didn't just own one plantation. He owned many plantations. And so Frederick's mother gave birth to him, and then he was separated from his mother and left to be raised by his grandmother. And that was his grandmother's primary job. She was old in age, couldn't work a lot, and so her primary work was raising her grandchildren. So this was the culture in their plantation. When her daughter, so Betsy Bailey, her role as a slave essentially was a breeder of more slaves. Frederick refers to his family and the other slaves as human stock or human cattle. He does this over and over again throughout his writings. And so he's raised by his grandmother, and whenever one of his grandmother's daughters, one of his aunts, had a baby, they would be separated from the mothers would be sent back to work, and then the babies were left in the care to be raised by his grandmother. The kids were raised by their grandmother usually until around the age of 7 or 8 years old, when they were fit to work. About 7 or 8, that's when they felt they were ready to start doing some good, hard work. And so Betsy would raise these kids, and she would not tell them. He lived his entire life, up until 7 or 8 years old, totally ignorant to the fact that ultimately he was going to be handed over from his grandmother over to the slave master to go work on the main plantation when he came of age. He didn't find out that he was getting handed over to old master, they called him, until about 24 hours before it was time to say goodbye to his grandmother. It was about a 12-mile walk. And that morning, his grandmother takes him by the hand, walks with him 12 miles, brings him to the big house of old master, and Frederick realizes what's happening. He's afraid. He starts crying. Some of the other slave kids, they call him to come and play. And he eventually consoles himself, and he goes and plays with the other slave kids. And as soon as he separates to go and play, his grandmother leaves. And that was one of the last times that he saw his grandmother. So this is the custom there. His grandmother, her lot in life was to have children and to see her children separated from her children, and then to raise her grandchildren, and then to hand her own grandchildren over to their slave master. That was her life, over and over and over again. His grandmother, ultimately, when she got up in age and she was beyond use, and the master had no use for her after he had supplied this plantation with generation after generation of human cattle, after being solely responsible through her womb for the wealth of his entire family, after handing over child and grandchild over and over again into violent slavery, when she was beyond use to this master, they built a little shack for her in the woods, and they sent her to live there and die alone to care for herself. And that is how Frederick Douglass's grandmother, Betsy Bailey, died. Alone, with none of her many children and grandchildren to care for her in her old age because they were all working for Old Master. Frederick noted that on the plantation, he would overhear tons of singing. And he says, my apologies, I don't know if I'm on the, he says on this sing, he says, every tone was a testimony against slavery and a prayer to God for deliverance. So this was the sound of the songs of the slaves that he heard. He didn't fully understand it at 7 or 8 years old, but this is how he described the music on the plantation. The living conditions were beyond imagination. He describes it like this. He says, the children stuck themselves in holes in corners about the quarters, often in the corner of the huge chimneys with their feet in ashes to keep them warm. His whole life, he describes, 7, 8 years, he never had shoes, he never had pants, he never had a shirt, he never had a bed. And this was year-round. In the hottest parts of summer and in the coldest days of winter, all he had was a sackcloth to cover his private parts. And he slept in the corners of chimneys with his feet in the ashes to keep warm. This was normal for the children. He starved regularly. Their rations for food were terrible. They worked from sun up to sundown. Once a month, all of the slaves would gather at the main plantation. It took 2 days because the old master, had close to 1,000 slaves. And they would take 2 days, and that's where they would get their rations and dole them out. And it equated a full-grown man, his rations would be the equivalent of a 1/4 pound of meat. And this would have been the worst quality of the meat. This would have been the chitlins and all that. This would have been that. About a 1/4 pound of meat that had to stretch for an entire week. That would be what a grown man working sun up to sundown had to live on, and a little bit of cornmeal. And that was it. That's what they lived on. Ultimately, Frederick had this experience. He starved. He had very little kindness shown to him. There was a woman who lived in the house named Lucretia, who had showed him some kindness, and he learned that if he would stand in front of her window and sing songs, that she would throw him pieces of bread. And so that's how he started dealing with his hunger. He would go and stand in the window of Lucretia, and he would sing, and eventually it became this unspoken agreement that if he sang and performed well enough for her, that she would throw him scraps of bread. They would hang around the table. So when they would come and clean the table and dust off the tablecloths, the little kids would stand around just hoping that scraps from the table would fall on the floor that they could fight over, just so they could have a little bit more to eat. He even documents times where he literally wrestled with the dogs for scraps of unwanted meat that had fallen on the ground. So this was slave life. This was what he describes. Keep in mind, he was a slave in Maryland. He describes in his writings that this was well known among the slaves to be the mildest form of slavery. Children sleeping in fireplaces, children separated from their grandmothers, sold off to hard labor, sent out to die alone in the woods after you've served your purpose. He documents that it is well known that the slavery he experienced in Maryland was the mildest form of slavery. It was nothing compared to what was experienced in the Deep South. So I want us to keep that in mind as well. That as vile as these things are, when you think about slavery and we think about how bad was it, and we think about this modern effort to retell and to sanitize what slavery was, if anything I've said to you has given you a guttural response for how bad is this, how inhumane is this, how could people treat other people this way, I want you to know that this was the mildest version of slavery. This is what he experienced. He had an opportunity to leave and go from the plantation in Maryland to Baltimore. So his master had relatives that lived in the city of Baltimore, and this was a well-to-do family, and they had a small child named Little Tommy, and Little Tommy was about the same age as Frederick, about 8 or 9 years old. And so the master sends Frederick to Baltimore to live with the Old family. The Old family are relatives of his master, and they need help with little Tommy, and so they send Frederick to be a servant to the Old family. Specifically, his task was to serve young Tommy. Anything little Tommy needed, Frederick's job was to take care of him. When they were walking down the street, it was Frederick's job to make sure he didn't get hit by a cart. If Tommy dropped something, it was Frederick's job to pick it up. He essentially operated as like a slave or a nanny almost to another kid his age, to kind of keep him out of his parents' hair. And so he was kind of gifted to the Auld family. And what was interesting here is that Frederick, for the first time going to Baltimore, felt human. It was the first time he was ever treated with any type of civility or kindness, but that came from ignorance. You see, the Old family, this was their first time ever owning a slave. They had no experience owning slaves. They weren't aware of the proper etiquette and customs and rules that needed to be in place to keep a slave. And so out of their ignorance, Frederick joins the Old family in Maryland, in Baltimore, and for the first time he has shoes, he has pants, he gets a shirt, he gets to sleep in a bed, he even gets to look them in the face when he talks to them. He documents all of this and how all of this for the first time made him feel like a human being. He felt like he begins to describe the Auld family as my family. And so he ingratiates himself into this family, and they're kind to him, and he feels like a human, but only because his new family doesn't know how to keep a slave. Let me jump a little ahead here. This is how he describes his time with the Old family. He says, "When I went into their family, it was the abode of happiness and contentment. The mistress of the house was a model of affection and tenderness. Her fervent piety and watchful uprightness made it impossible to see her without thinking and feeling that woman is a Christian. There was no sorrow nor suffering for which she had not a tear, and there was no innocent joy for which she did not smile. She had bread for the hungry, clothes for the naked, comfort for every mourner that came within her reach. Slavery soon proved its ability to divest her of these excellent qualities and her home of its early happiness." He went into what he would describe as a healthy Christian home. And the very act of owning another person as a slave reduced her, took away all of the endearing qualities, anything that made her look holy and happy and joyful. All of it eventually wasted away because she had to essentially corrupt herself in order to be a good slaveholder. And the entire tone of their home, all of the warmth, all of the love, all of the joy, all of the care, all of it disappeared so that she could fit in to this institution called slavery. Freddie, as they called him, daily he would see Miss Sophia Ould reading her Bible, and she always read the Bible out loud. And so every day he would overhear this, and because of his relationship with her, and because of their mutual ignorance, Freddie asks Miss Sophia to teach him to read the Bible. Now, anybody knows, most people know, that teaching slaves how to read is a big no-no. But Frederick, he says, will you teach me to read the Bible? And because of her ignorance, she never owned a slave before. She's excited. She says, absolutely, I'll teach you how to read the Bible. And so she begins to teach him to read the Bible. He begins to learn the alphabet. He begins to learn how to read basic scriptures. And as he's learning these things, she's so proud. He doesn't know he's doing anything scandalous in learning. She doesn't know she's doing anything scandalous in teaching him. And eventually one day, she wasn't doing this in secret. She wants to tell her husband, because her husband, by and large, just totally dismissed Freddie. He was like, that's Tommy's boy, whatever, you can do what you want. And out of her pride for her star pupil, she tells her husband, Hugh Old, that Frederick is such a great pupil. He's learning to read. He knows his alphabet, all this stuff. And immediately, when learning this, Mr. Old shuts it down. And this is when he tells his wife, he goes to his wife and he says, if you give an inch, he will take an ell. But more specifically, he goes on to say, Frederick overhears this, if you teach that, speaking of myself, how to read the Bible, if you teach him how to read the Bible, there will be no keeping him. It would forever make him unfit for the duties of a slave. Now, let me just, I need us to think about this right now, because I don't care whether you're talking to your family, whether you're at a barbershop, whether you talk enough, you're not going to have to talk a lot until you hear somebody try to convince you that, if you're a black Christian in America, if you're a descendant of slaves, you're probably only a Christian because Christianity was forced on your ancestors through slavery. It was forced on them. And you're a Christian today because you just don't know any better. Our ancestors, the slaves didn't want to be Christians. It was beat into them. It was forced on them. But what we see when we study history is the exact opposite. They did everything in their power to keep slaves not just from reading, but from reading the Bible. Because in reading God's word, he says that there will be no keeping him. That the Bible and what it teaches is so inconsistent with the system of slavery that we have in place that it will be impossible to keep him, that it will make him forever unfit to be a slave. Forever. This is what the Bible teaches. If anybody is trying to tell you that Christianity was forced on slaves, that the Bible condones slavery, that it was used to subject and oppress black people and force them into subjugation, let me tell you something like this. Let me tell you, the issue wasn't that he learned how to read. The issue is that he learned how to read the Bible. Think about this. He went from Baltimore. This is how serious this is. We cannot let slaves read the Bible. This is how serious this is. When he was on the plantation, he had no shoes. He had no pants. He had no shirt. He had no bed. He had no food. He had none of those things. When he goes to the big city of Baltimore, these people who are totally ignorant about how to keep a slave, they treat him with dignity. They let him look him in the face, and nobody says anything. They give him shoes, and nobody says anything. They give him pants, and nobody complains. They give him a bed to sleep in, and nobody says anything. But the moment he learns to read the Bible, he says, we cannot let this happen. There will be no keeping him. He will be totally unfit to be a slave, and shut it down. The system of slavery and the upholding of slavery is only possible not by enforcing Christianity on people, but by withholding it from slaves at any cost. To keep him ignorant, to give him any sense of truth that the Bible taught. Old knew there will be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him for the duties of a slave. Frederick at this point was 8 or 9 years old, and he's overhearing this. And imagine a child hearing this. He's learning how to read. He has a teacher. He's learning the scriptures, and then it gets shut down. And he experienced some hopelessness and some disappointment. But, this was a smart brother. And he sat with that and he thought about that and he meditated on that. And this is what he thought to himself. He said, his iron sentences, cold and harsh, sunk deep into my heart and stirred up not only my feelings into a sort of rebellion, but awakened within me a slumbering train of vital thought. In teaching me the alphabet, in the days after her simplicity and kindness, my mistress had given me the inch, and now no ordinary precaution could prevent me from taking the L. All he had was the alphabet and the Bible. And everything that happens in his life is a springboard off of this moment, off of this realization that in his being rebuked, in his being oppressed, in his being restrained by professing Christians, get this, professing Christians were intentionally keeping him from learning the Bible. And in this, he learned, okay, the difference between slavery and freedom is found in these pages. And he determined there's nothing that's going to keep me out this book. And so from that point on, man, he lived his life scouring for knowledge. Anything he can get his hands on. He was taking the Bible when nobody was home. He would walk the streets, and he documents times where he would find individual pages of the Bible that had been just like strewn about in the street. And anytime he'd see something like that, he'd pick it up and clean it off and fold it up and hide it like contraband. And when he was in his room at night, this is what he was studying: dirty pages of scripture that he found laying in the street. And this began to shape his faith in his life. So he steals Bibles, newspapers. He even takes homework assignments from other kids. Anything he could do to take the L. That's what he did. Unfortunately, he had to go back to the plantation. Yo, I just realized my time's up already. That's crazy. All right, I'm about to speed up for real. All right. Back to the plantation he goes. What happened is old master, remember, the old family didn't own him. He was in their care. He belonged to old master. And old master was essentially just loaning him out to the old family. But when old master died, all of his property had to be accounted for, and so all of his slaves, no matter where they were, had to come back to the plantation so that they could be divvied up among his relatives. And so he has to come back from Baltimore. He ends up back at the plantation, and then unfortunately, as the human stock is divided, he ends up with a Master Thomas Old. This is different than Little Tommy. This is a different Old. But he ends up in the servitude of Master Thomas Old. And Master Thomas Old was violent. He was committed to hard labor. He went back to starvation and back to an environment where he had no hope of reading. And so now he's in the servitude of Thomas Old. And he begins to wrestle with different moral issues like stealing. He's so hungry. And he's like, man, maybe I should just steal from a master. Imagine working in a kitchen in a plantation house and you're surrounded by food, but you can't steal it. All you have is your little rations. And so he put a lot of thought into trying to find a way to justify stealing from his master, and he figured it out. He said, hold on, I thought this was funny. He said, the taking his meat out of one tub and putting it into another, the ownership of the meat was not affected by the transaction. At first, he owned it in the tub, and at last, he owned it in me. And so that cleared his conscience, man. He was stealing food all the time. He was like, he owns the tub, he owns me. It's in the tub, it's in me. Either way. Oh, man. So Frederick on the plantation, he begins to teach some of the other kids to read, and he does this in secret. He's able to read, and there's tons of kids on the plantation, and he wants to help other kids begin to take the L. So in secret, he begins teaching the kids at the plantation how to read. And look what happens. He says, our first Sabbath passed delightfully, and I spent the week after very joyously. I could not go to Baltimore, but I could make a little Baltimore here. At our second meeting, I learned that there was some objection to the existence of the Sabbath school. And sure enough, we had scarcely got at work, good work, simply teaching a few colored children how to read the gospel of the Son of God, when in rushed a mob headed by Mr. Wright Fairbanks and Mr. Garrison West, two class leaders, and Master Thomas, who, armed with sticks and other missiles, drove us off and commanded us never to meet for such a person again. Tell me again where they are forcing Christianity on the slaves. Show me again. If anything, by force, they're doing everything they can to keep Christianity from the slaves. Whether it was reading the Bible, whether it was gathering to learn, everything they could do was driving them away from the God of the Bible, and yet the God of the Bible still had their hearts. Frederick spends the next 6 months because of his knowledge. Remember, he said if he learns how to read the Bible, it will make him unfit to be a slave. Well, that's exactly what happened. He's growing in his knowledge, and he is unfit to be a slave. He understands that there is a minimal level of dignity that he is owed, and he is not willing to accept anything less. And so he becomes non-compliant, and so Master Thomas ends up sending Frederick to a man known as the Negro Breaker. The Negro Breaker. Edward Covey was a former overseer who was now a poor plantation owner. And let me tell you, a poor plantation owner was the worst type of plantation owner. And so he didn't have enough money to buy his own slaves. And so what he did to have his plantation worked was he made it known to all the well-to-do plantation owners, give me your most unruly slaves, the ones that you cannot break, send them to me for 1 year, and I will send them back broken. And so that's how he got free labor to work his plantations. The worst of the worst slaves, the most non-compliant slaves, Edward Covey would take them and he would work them like dogs for a year. It was violent. It was, when you think about the worst stories of slavery, imagine the worst things you can imagine about slavery and imagine them happening to you at least every single week for a year. And that's what it was like to live with Edward Covey. He was a poor plantation owner, and he was determined to break slaves, specifically to break Frederick Douglass. His tactics were starvation, regular whippings, surprise visits. He literally laid traps for them. And his goal was to instill constant fear. He would, when they were working in the fields, he would ride up on his horse and tell them, I've got to go such and such a place. I'll be gone for the next 12 hours or so, whatever it is. And then he would ride just out of sight, and he would tie his horse to a tree and army crawl back and watch them in the fields. And as soon as he caught them doing anything wrong, he would come storming out the fields and beat them to a pulp. And so they had this sense. They never knew when they weren't being watched. They knew they couldn't trust a single thing that he said. He intentionally employed stealth and craftiness and deception, and he was always saying one thing and doing another thing. He wouldn't even come up to them. He wouldn't walk through doors. He would pop up under windows and stuff like that. Frederick documents all of this stuff. And so this was his method. Brutal, nonstop violence, surprises, traps, constant fear. And eventually, it led to Frederick being broken. He describes himself as utterly broken. He writes extensively about his doubts that he began to have in God. And Edward Covey was a professing Christian. And so he couldn't reconcile that God was real and that God was good. And yet somehow God had just decided that because he was black, this is how he was supposed to live. And he just couldn't make sense out of this. And so his countenance, his confidence, his desire to read, his faith, everything began to crumble as he succumbed to the beatings and the torment of Edward Covey, the Negro breaker. Ultimately, what finally brings him the last straw, he's working for Edward Covey. He passes out from heat exhaustion, and Edward Covey begins to stomp him out in the ground and demand that he get up and keep working. Frederick does everything he can to try and get up, but he's so sick he can't remain standing. Every time he stands, he falls back down. And when he falls back down, he gets stomped out by Covey. And then finally, he mustered up the ability to just say, something's wrong with my head. He's dizzy, he has a headache, he made reference to something being wrong with his head. And then Covey said, fine, I'll fix your head, and pulled out a club and bashed his head in. And he said that was, for some reason, relief. The coolness of the blood covering his head and face was finally some relief. And he passed out. He woke up some hours later, beaten beyond recognition, and he got this thought. He said, man, if I can just get my way back to Master Thomas and he can see my condition, maybe he'll bring me back from Covey. Maybe he'll let me finish my time with the Negro breaker. And so when he wakes up, it's about an 8-mile walk. Through all of this, he somehow stumbles through the night, through the woods, and brings himself back to the home of his actual master, Master Thomas. And he's thinking that he'll see his condition. He knows that Master Thomas is a Christian, and he wouldn't treat me like this. And Master Thomas sees him, tells him that he probably deserved it because he was being lazy, and sends him back to Edward Covey. And that's when he was done. He was like, I got nothing left. He makes his way back to Covey. As soon as he pulls up on the plantation, Covey sees him in the distance, and he takes off running. He knows he's got a beating coming. And so Frederick, he runs and hides, and he dives in this field and covers himself in all types of brush and stuff like that, and then hides. And then they're just not able to find him. They decide, you know what? He's going to get hungry. It's going to get dark and cold. He'll come in. And so he stays out there all night, and then in the night, he hears some footsteps, and then he realized the footsteps are of a slave named Sandy who's from a neighboring plantation. And he finds a friend in Sandy. And Sandy actually takes Frederick, hides him, helps him recover, and then he has a conversation with Frederick. He's like, you got to do one of two things. You got to go back to Covey and take this beating, or you got to try to get free. One of two things. But it wasn't the appropriate time or place. He didn't have the resources to attempt his freedom, so he decides, I've got to go back to Covey. And so it was Sunday morning. He makes his way back to Covey's plantation, and when he gets to Covey's plantation on Sunday morning, he sees Covey and his wife outside dressed to the nines. They're on their way to church. And they see Frederick, and they smile at him like nothing. And they say, oh, Frederick, good to see you. Please tend to such and such. We'll see you later. And they leave and they go off to church. And he's flabbergasted. He's like, what's going on? Well, it turns out beating your slaves is working on the Sabbath. And so these pious Christians, they were so pious that they would not break the Sabbath, but they would break slaves as long as they didn't break the slaves on the Sabbath. And so he's trying to figure this out. Man, he goes to he's back on the plantation. No harm has come from him. But remember Covey's tactics: sneaking, scare tactics, surprise attacks, stuff like that. So Monday comes, he wakes up crack of dawn. He's like, oh, I'm working hard today because I don't want to give him any reason to, maybe I can get through this unscathed. So he's doing his work. He ends up, I think, in a stable of some sort, and he's working. And let me get my slides up. Hold on. Yeah, he's working, and he's working in the stables, and Covey, on Monday morning, because it's not the Sabbath now, this guy army crawls into the stables behind Frederick and takes his legs out, and he's got a rope, and he's ready to hog tie him. He's about to do some real bad stuff to Frederick. And so Frederick, in this moment, he decides, you know what? I'm done with this. I'm ready to fight. And so, Frederick, he says, my religious views on the subject of resisting my master had suffered a serious shock. By the savage persecution to which I had been subjected, my hands were no longer tied by my religion. I soon had occasion to make my fallen state known to my Sunday pious brother, Covey. He said, I was resolved to fight, and what was better still, I was actually hard at it. Those some gangster words right there. I don't know about you. So they get into a legit fight. He gets into a fight with the Negro breaker. And it says, Covey was taken all aback by it, for he trembled in every limb. It says, are you going to resist, you scoundrel? He said, to which I returned a polite, yes, sir. And they end up fighting. He says, where are we at? The fight with Covey ended up lasting 2 hours. 2 hours they fought, and ultimately Covey gave up. When you read the story of this fight, it's actually kind of funny because they're fighting in the stables, and another slave comes in named Bill, and then Covey's like, Bill, take hold of him. And Bill's like, I got work to do. He said, and Bill just dips out, like, Master, you already gave me work to do. I got to be over here. So Bill leaves him. So then Covey, he calls out to his cousin. His cousin lived on the plantation, so he calls out to Hugh. So he's called, I think his name is Hugh. I can't remember what his name is. But he calls out to his cousin. And his cousin comes, and he sees him, and his cousin jumps in to try to help out. And then Frederick, he details how he one shot knocks out his cousin. And his cousin ended up hunched over in the corner and refused to re-engage the fight. And so then he's still fighting with Covey, and then one of the female slaves comes from the house, and then Covey's like, take hold of him. And she's like, nah, I can't get involved with this. And he's like, we were all in open rebellion at this point. And so he fights for 2 hours, and then finally Covey gives up, and he says, during the whole 6 months that I lived with Covey after this transaction, he never laid on me the weight of his finger in anger. He had finally beaten the Negro breaker. And the thing about this is he never got in trouble for it. Normally the consequence for a slave attacking their master is to be hung. But the Negro breaker couldn't hang him because his money and his reputation was built on his ability to break slaves. But now, what's he supposed to do? Is some slave whoop me in a fair fight? Like, nobody's going to pay him to break slaves no more. So he just had to take the L, a different type of L. Oh, man. And so he says, Frederick says, it is perhaps not altogether credible to my natural temper that after this conflict with Mr. Covey, I did, at times, purposely aim to provoke him to an attack by refusing to keep with the other hands in the field. But I could never bully him to another battle. I had made up my mind to do him serious damage if he ever again attempted to lay violent hands on me. And when I was reading that, I thought to myself, I don't know if this is true, but Frederick Douglass might have been the first Negro to ever think to himself, I wish a master would. Oh, man. So I'm going to fast forward here. Ultimately, Frederick makes multiple attempts at freedom. The first one he fails, and he ends up being arrested and going to jail. Sometime later, he attempts again, and he is successful and makes his way up to New York. Now, he purposely does not write about how he escaped. He writes about why he won't tell you. And so he actually has a gripe with some of the other abolitionists because he's like, yo, if we keep writing down and telling the stories about how we escaped, then more people won't be able to escape in the same fashion. He actually criticizes the Underground Railroad by calling it the Upperground Railroad, because he's like, the stations are just as well known to the slave catchers as they are to the slaves. And so secrecy was really important to him. He argued that there should have been thousands more Box Browns if Box Brown didn't tell everybody about how he got free. If you don't know the story of Box Brown is he put himself in a box and shipped himself to the north. And when they opened the crate, he was in a free state. He was the first Negro to ship himself via UPS. And it worked out. I ain't gonna lie. So the way my mind works, I was sitting there thinking, I was like, man, I wonder how that would work today. Because now we got you can track your package. So I'm wondering, like, man, what would it be like to be in a box and on a smartphone, like tracking myself? Like, man, almost there. And then I was thinking, you know how frustrating it is when you order something from Amazon and it tells you it's coming today, and then about 8 p.m. it's like there's been a delay. I was thinking, imagine being in that box and getting that notification. You're like, come on, man, I didn't pack for this. But anyway, he arrives in New York, but he ends up settling in New Bedford in 1838. He marries Anne Murray, a free black woman. And then he has a number of notable accomplishments. He is the leading voice in the abolitionist movement. He becomes an advocate for the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. He becomes an advisor to two presidents, Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Jackson. He becomes the U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia. He founds the North Star, an abolitionist newspaper. He advocates for women's voting rights. In all of that, he still taught Sunday school at his church. And ultimately, when we ask the question about how his faith informs his thinking, how his faith informs how he thinks about slavery, his pursuit of freedom, and his political endeavors, he famously writes, "I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land. Indeed, I can see no reason but the most deceitful one for calling the religion of this land Christianity. I look upon it as the climax of all misnomers, the boldest of all frauds, and the grossest of all libels." So not only has Frederick Douglass dispelled this notion that Christianity was forced on him and his contemporaries, but he shows that all effort was put towards keeping them from Christ and from the scriptures. And not only that, when we make claims like Christianity was forced on our ancestors, we're unknowingly saying certain things about our ancestors. We're saying we don't think our ancestors were intellectually capable enough to understand a truth from a lie. We're saying that we don't understand that our ancestors, we don't believe they had the backbone to stand on their convictions when we make these claims. And so I am claiming, and Frederick Douglass is claiming the exact opposite. He is claiming, and I am claiming, that black Christians, our ancestors, yes, even the slaves, they had the intellect and they had the capability to discern not just what Christianity was, but to separate true Christianity from a false Christianity. And when pressed to abandon Christ or pursue him at the cost of their lives and their physical well-being, they had the backbone to pursue Christ at whatever it costs. And so, is Christianity the white man's religion? Not the real Christianity. Frederick knew that, and my hope is that we can put that argument to bed here in 2025. Amen? Amen. Let me pray for us. We'll go to intermission. Lord, thank you for the life and faith of Frederick Douglass. Thank you for how you blessed him to persevere. Thank you for the glimmers of faith that he was able to hold on to on plantations and in big cities and in the process of being broken. God, thank you for compelling him to write it down so that we can learn today from the wisdom that he gained. God, help us to look at history with open eyes. Help us to not sanitize the past. Help us to not rewrite things as they were, rewrite things and try to paint them as something different today. But to look at it for what it was, to look at vile things and call them vile, to look at sinful things and call them sinful, to look at false Christianity and call it false, to look at institutions and abhor them because they are abhorrent. And help us to learn. Help us to learn, to love, and to pursue the whole man. Help us to, like Frederick Douglass, proclaim not with our mouths but with our actions that every person who is drawing breath is actively bearing the image of the God who made them. And because of that, they have value, and they have meaning, and they have something to offer this world. Help us to live like that. Help us to talk like that. In Jesus' name, amen.